Hey everybody, welcome to the fourth episode of the Network Automation series, and today we're going to look at doing some interface configurations. Now in the last episode, we looked at how we could use group variables to assign things like NTP, SNMP, or banner. We looked at how we could use the Ansible inventory hostname to set the hostname on our devices. And today we're going to look at how we can create a structure to manage things like our interfaces. And when we think about interfaces, interfaces are really unique to the host. We generally don't have groups of interfaces that are the same across different devices or different platforms, and we need a way to handle the differences between each of these devices. And that comes in the form of the host vars file that we can create with our Ansible playbooks. And what host vars allows us to do is set up variables that allow us to configure things like our interfaces and our focus to the host. So if I have interfaces or I have VLANs or I have things that are unique to a device, I can put them there and the device will know how to configure itself. But when we're doing those files and we're actually building them out, we have to think about how we scale it across multiple devices. Now here we only have two devices. We have a router and a switch. So there's some pretty specific differences between these two platforms. But if we think about it, they both have interfaces. They both have interfaces that need to be enabled. They both have interfaces that need descriptions, but the names are different. The way you might call the commands could be different if it's a different vendor. In this case, it's all Cisco, so we're going to have pretty similar command sets. But when you start getting into more nuanced things about the devices, you're going to run into things that you need to adjust for per platform. And so what we're going to look at is how do we structure our file sets so that we can use the variables across all the platforms, build some very easy to work with playbooks, and then look at the modules that we would use to configure all of these devices. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to jump over to Visual Studio Code now. We're going to take a look at building our interface configurations today, the modules we're going to use, and start working through setting up our playbooks. So let's jump over to Visual Studio Code now. Okay, so we're over in Visual Studio Code, and we're going to go ahead and get our directory structure set up. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this interface config. And inside there, we're going to want to have our Ansible config and inventory that we've been working with. So I'm going to come to the show commands directory. I'm just going to copy and paste it into interface config. So now we have the host that we want to work with today, and we have our defaults for where to find how we want to run our Ansible playbooks by default. Now we need to create two additional folders. We're going to do a tasks folder, similar to what we did with the basic system config. We're going to manage our module and our actual tasks inside a specific folder. And then we're going to come back and we're going to do another new folder, and we're going to call this one host_vars. Now the host vars folder is very similar to this group vars folder, except it's specific to the host. So the things that we put in there are going to be variables that will exist for the Cat AKV internet or the Nexus 9K switch 1. And these variables here, these would be considered host vars. So just if I wanted to, I could put another variable in here. I could call this interface. And I could put interface details in here, and these would be considered host vars. But as we mentioned earlier in the series, the inventory file should be really clean. If you think about what we're looking at right now, we've only got two devices. If you were to scale this out to lots of devices, you wouldn't want to have your variable files for your hosts inside the inventory file. You absolutely could. For a small deployment, it wouldn't be a problem. But if you start thinking about scaling things out, it's really beneficial to maintain your host variables in a file in this host vars folder. Under host vars, we're going to want to create two files a day, and we're going to name them exactly what they are in the inventory. So we're going to do c8kv-internet.yaml, and we're going to create another new folder, or another new file, and we're going to call it n9kv-sw1.yaml. And so we have the two host vars files that we're going to work with today to actually get our interfaces configured. We have our inventory file with those hosts. We're going to get our modules that we're going to use today. We're going to actually go take a look at that now. And we have our Ansible config. And then at some point, we'll actually build the playbook that runs those tasks and start, running some interface configuration on our devices. So let's go ahead and take a look at our Ansible docs and see what our modules for today are going to be. So let's go to terminal here, and we're going to go Ansible-doc-L. And then we're going to do a / and do cisco.ios. Now today we're going to use the iOS_interfaces and the iOS_L3 interfaces for our Catalyst device. We could use this iOS config module, and basically if you know how to configure iOS interfaces using config T, selecting your interface by doing interface gigabit 1 for instance, and then applying the IP address, no shutdown description, things like that, you could enter that raw config in through the iOS config module and actually configure your devices that way. There are some use cases for iOS config, but one of the issues I have with it is it doesn't really scale super well, especially if you're going to do a lot of different devices. So if we use the iOS interfaces and the iOS L3 interfaces, it gives us a little more flexibility for the router to manage different aspects of the interfaces. And we'll look at how both of those work in just a few seconds. We're going to move forward. We're going to look at the NX OS ones. And again, we have the NX OS config module here, which would do very similar things to the Catalyst one, or I should say iOS. But we have, again, NX OS interfaces, and we're going to look at the L2 and L3 for the Nexus because it's a switch, and there's some aspects that we're going to want to configure on both devices. So let's go ahead and look at the iOS interfaces real quick. So we do Ansible-doc, and we do cisco.ios.ios_interfaces. Now the purpose of this module is to manage interface attributes. And if we look through this module, we can see that we're going to do configuration, and it's going to let us set the description. We can control the duplex, the administrative stage, so whether we've no shut or shut the interface, the mode, so whether it's an L2 or L3. Now this is important because in router, we're not going to have to worry about this. But for a switch, if we were using a Catalyst 9300 or some kind of iOS-based switch, mode would allow us to change a switch port from layer 2 to layer 3. We can also control the MTU. We can assign the name of the interface we want to work with, speed. So there's a lot of capability in this module, but not anything in here specifically on configuring IP addresses. And if we come down and look, we can see it does some basic configuration of the name, description, whether it's enabled or not, MTU. But if we wanted to set the IP address, we would need to use the L3_interfaces module, which is now going to let us configure the auto state if we had an SVI on a layer 3 switch. We could do IPv4 address, we could set DHCP, we can do DHCP client configuration, host name, source interface. There's a lot of different details that we can apply, IPv6 address. And so this is giving you more of the layer 3 control options for the interface. If we scroll down, again, we can look at some sample config where we configure the name of the interface we want to work with, the IPv4 address, and then if we want to set IPv6, you can see where we need 2 modules to actually configure the interface in full. So let's now look at the NX OS side, and it's going to be pretty similar. And we see again, this is going to manage the attributes of the NX OS interfaces. So very similar structure, config, description, duplex. You see there is a unique option here for fabric forwarding Anycast gateway, and that's, if we're going to do SVIs with the fabric forwarding mode and a VXLAN fabric. Setting IP forward, again, components you use with the VXLAN fabrics. Mode, MTU. So very similar to the iOS one, but a little bit different from it in terms of there's additional capability on the Nexus switches. Again, we can see some sample configuration of how it would apply things, how the interfaces would get set up with NXOS. But again, this is strictly to enable and describe the interface. If we wanted to do some configuration, and since we already looked at the L3 side, we're going to look at the L2 side. Again, we get a configuration. We're going to say whether we have an access port, what VLAN it's assigned to. Is it a trunk? Is it an access port? What VLANs are we allowing on the trunk? Are we using a native VLAN? And then again, sample code for how it would be configured. So, the base level interface that's focused on, let's describe the interface. What description do we want on it? What is the state of it? Is it on or off? So no shut or shutdown. And then if we're going to do any additional things like MTU or speed, we can control it there. The L2 or L3 interface modules are going to give us the ability to control layer 2 aspects or layer 3 aspects of those interfaces. So for the purpose of today's lab, we want to focus on getting the interfaces configured, get WAN connectivity out, build an IP address between our Catalyst AKV and Nexus, and then for the future, we want to be able to set VLANs to connect a host up in our Nexus environment. So let's go over and take a look at our lab real quick and see what our interfaces are going to be that we're going to configure so we can start building out our host variable files. Looking at our lab, we have the Cat AKV internet, which has two interfaces on it, one connected to the WAN NAT bridge and the other connected to our Nexus 9KV. For the WAN NAT connection, we're running virtual bridge NAT, and that's going to assign a DHCP address to gig 1. So we want the interface for gig 1 to be using the IP address DHCP command. For gig 2, we're going to do a point-to-point layer 3 interface between the Catalyst and the Nexus device. So we're going to use the layer 3 configuration module to set an IP address and get a IP and mask set up. For the Nexus switch, we need to convert this port. So because of the Nexus switch, all the interfaces usually are switch port by default. We're going to convert the switch port to layer 3. So we're going to change the mode of the interface. And we're going to set ETH11 to layer 3, assign an IP address to it that's part of the same network as G2. And then we're going to add another interface as part of the module to leverage the L2 interfaces module. And I'm going to take one of these interfaces. We'll do 1/2 since it's the next interface up. And that'll be the interface that we use to set a access VLAN for a future host that we want to connect to this network. And that'll give us an overview of how the L3 module, the L2 module, and the just base interfaces module work for both iOS and NXOS. So let's pop back over to Visual Studio Code and start configuring our playbooks and our variable files. We're going to go ahead and talk about setting up the variables for our two hosts today, and we're going to start with Cat AKV Internet. Now, when we think about interface configuration, there's things that need to be done to an interface to get it to come online and set the various parameters we want to do. So we're going to create a variable here called interfaces, and we're going to create this variable to be a list. We want the value of interfaces to be a list of different interfaces that are on our device. This is not necessarily the only way to configure your values. It's a way I like to use because I think it's super simple to be able to loop through the interfaces, get out the specific things I want. So I can set my name, I can set a description, I can set an IP address, and I have a lot of flexibility into what values are in that list. So we're going to start with our name, and we're going to call it Gigabit Ethernet 1. We're going to do description. I'm just going to do a short DSC, and this is going to be WAN/NAT interface. We're going to do a state, and we're going to say enabled. Actually, we're going to do enabled true. And then we're going to set IP DHCP, and then we're going to go back. We're going to do a new name, and we'll call it Gigabit Ethernet 2 description is going to be link to N9KV switch 1. Enabled will be true. IP will be 192.168.100.254/24. Now, on a Catalyst device, you would traditionally have to give it the mask that you want to use. The module for Ansible is able to convert a CIDR address, in this case, to understand what net mask it needs to apply. So when you're setting your IP, you can just say, I want to use 192.168.100.254/24, and it will know to use 255.255.255.0 in the configuration when it sets these interfaces up. So we've got the two interfaces set up. You can see we have an IP address, we have a DHCP statement. We know that in our configuration, using IP DHCP was a different option from setting up the actual IP address. But we'll look at that when we actually go to configure the task for setting up these interfaces. But this will get our interfaces turned up, get a description on them, and get them operational on the Catalyst side. We'll save this, and we're going to copy this file, and we're going to do an interfaces for the Nexus, and we'll call this Ethernet 1.1. We're going to do description, link to cat 8kv-internet. Actually, I guess we'll do c8kv-internet since that's the name. Enabled true. IP address be 192.168.100.253/24. And then we are going to do mode layer 3. For Ethernet 1.2, we're going to call this access port config for the description, just to give it a generic name. The enabled state is going to be true. The IP address, it is not going to have an IP address assigned to it. I'm going to set the mode to layer 2. I'm going to set IP to none. So what this is doing is it's getting rid of the IP address. We're saying we don't have an IP address. You're going to see when we set up our playbook, I have this very simple configuration now for my interface. I have the IP address for interface 1.1. I have the access port configuration for 1.2. I'm managing all in this same list. I'm using none as a value to say, hey, when you go to configure layer 3 interfaces, if the IP is not none, then go ahead and apply the configuration, but ignore it if you see none. So this is how you can have an IP address for one interface or a different configuration for any interface, but handle the exceptions of where we're going to have things where we don't have VLANs. We're going to come back and we're going to save this, and we're just going to get our interfaces configured for layer 3 right now. And then we'll look at how we get the layer 2 stuff set up after we get the layer 3 interfaces running. So let's go ahead now and set up our tasks to get these interfaces configured. In the tasks folder, we're going to create a new file, and we're going to call this interface_configs.yaml. We're going to create a new line for name. We're going to call this configure and enable Cisco iOS interfaces. We're going to use the cisco.ios.ios_interfaces module, and we're going to do config. Now, the iOS_interface modules, if we go back and take a look at it real quick, there was a couple things we needed to do. So Ansible doc. And we are going to want to do config, which we've already got. We want to do description. We need to set the administrative state. So we're going to set enabled as a value, and then we're going to do name. So let's start with name. We're going to do a list, because that is the way this is supposed to be done. So if we come back up, it says a dictionary of interface options, and it is a type of list. So we're going to do list. We're going to do name. And we're going to do double quote, 2 brackets, item.name. And this is referencing the values that we set in our host vars file for cat.akv. So we do item.description, which is just item.desc, and then enabled item can't type, item.enabled. All right. So I like configuring my tasks file and my interfaces as a loop. If we come down and we look at an example, you can see that the way they have you do it is you merge the configuration with the device configuration. Well, they show you this, and we're looking at 2 interfaces that would be for a specific device. And when we're configuring these host vars, the task would be for a device to configure its interfaces. By looping through it, we're creating a playbook that we can use across all of our iOS devices, independent of which device it is. If this was cat.akv internet, if this was cat.akv internet 2, wherever this cat.akv is on our internet, we could use this same block and this same structure of our variable with this list to configure our devices. Otherwise, I would have to copy this and configure another block for gig 2. And you can see quickly where not only are you managing all of your individual device interfaces, but now you're managing a lot of extra code inside the tasks, where I've limited that configuration to the actual variables. So I've got my 2 interfaces here. I'm going to loop through it, get the name, description, and the state, and it's done. We're going to set the when parameter to Ansible _network_OS is iOS, so that we don't run it on our NXOS. And then we're going to do a loop through interfaces. The next thing we're going to do is do our layer 3 configuration. So I'm going to do configure and configure layer 3 IP on Cisco iOS interfaces. We're going to do cisco.ios.ios_L3_interfaces because that is the module. We'll do config again, and we'll come down here and once again take a look at the module. So we can see that it's going to ask us to do config. We can do the auto state variables, but we don't need that. So we're going to look at config. And we're going to scroll down and we're going to look at a sample configuration. So we can see in this example here, we've got name, which again is a list. We can copy this block here because we've already got that set up. The next section is going to be IPv4. And then we're going to set an address, which is going to be item.ip. So once again, we're going to loop through interfaces. We're going to get the name and IP. Now there's obviously a DHCP address that we need to account for. We're not going to do it as part of this task in this part of the section, the tasks that we're building. We're going to build another task for configuring layer 3 DHCP or configuring DHCP on Cisco iOS interfaces. To manage the fact that DHCP is not a valid IP, it's not a valid option here. If we wanted to set DHCP, there should be an example, let's see, right here. We'd have IPv4, we'd have DHCP, and then we would have enabled true. Well, that's not anything matching what our address setup is. So if we look at this, if we were to loop through the configuration, it would go to IPv4 address item.ip. And I haven't run this, but I suspect it's going to fail on DHCP because it's not a valid IP. And I don't think it's going to take that as a valid address because it's going to be looking for an IPv4 address. So what I want to do is say when we're going to take this Ansible Network OS iOS, because that's the first part we want to focus on. And then we're going to say and item.ip does not equal DHCP. Put that in double quotes. So what we're saying is you're only going to run this when you have an iOS network OS, and you're only going to run this if item.ip doesn't equal DHCP. So we're going to skip the DHCP, but we'll get the one that actually has the IP address. To handle the situation of having a DHCP address to set up, I'm going to expand this all back out now. We're going to do configure DHCP IP on iOS. We still do item.name. We still have IPv4, but now we have this block. Instead of address, we do DHCP. And then we say enable true. And we can say when Ansible Network OS equals iOS and item IP equals DHCP, run this block. So now I'm able to handle two different scenarios. If I have a bunch of different interfaces that are going to have IP addresses on them, I can configure those IPs. If I have a situation where one of my interfaces or a couple are using DHCP configurations, those interfaces will loop through name, look for the DHCP in item.ip, and set this configuration. And we need to make sure we grab the loop for interfaces so that we actually loop through our list of interfaces. And that covers the iOS XE side. Now we're going to configure the NXOS side. We only need to grab this block. I'm going to focus on getting the layer 3 configurations done first, and then we'll look at the layer 2. So we'll come back. We're going to change this to NXOS. Change that to NX. Change that to NX. And as we saw when we were looking through the configs, very similar. So I'm not going to change anything here, but we know that there was an option in there called mode. Actually, we'll go back and look at the doc because I want to show you just that little difference. Because it was there for iOS XE as well, but we need to set the layer 2 state. I think I did layer 3, that's why. All right, so we need to set the layer 2 or layer 3 state of the interface. So we see mode is an option. Because this is a switch, it's one more thing we need to take into account for. So we're going to copy the item.enabled just to make our life easy and change this to item.mode. We can see that for the Nexus 9K, we're going to look at a mode of layer 3 for ETH1.1, and for ETH1.2, we'll do layer 2, which is the default state generally on Nexus. So that'll make sure that our NXOS devices are set up with a name, a description, making sure they're enabled, and making sure that the mode is set to layer 2 or 3. For our NXOS layer 3 interface, we're going to do iOS. We're going to change this iOS to NXOS. We're going to do name, item.ip, change this to NXOS. And what we're going to do here is on a layer 2 interface, we're not going to have an IP. So we're going to say when item.ip does not equal none. And now this should allow us to configure our devices for layer 3 interfaces on both Nexus and Cisco iOS platforms. So what we want to do now is go back to interface config at the top here, create a new file under our directory called configure interfaces.yaml. And this is going to be our actual playbook. So we're going to set hosts to all, gather underscore facts to false, get our first set of tasks. And because we already did this for basic system config, we're going to copy this import tasks block. We're going to come down to configure interfaces, paste it, and then just change this to interface underscore configs.yaml. Config ints. So now I'm importing that task. I'm setting a tag of configure ints so that if I had other stuff happening in here for interface configuration, I'm only focused on the interface configs. This is going to set up the state of the interfaces, they're going to no shut them. They're going to set IP addresses. They'll set DHCP where it's relevant. They'll get the point-to-point up. And when we're done, we should be able to go look at the devices and see in CML that they're up and running and they've got their IPs assigned. So let's go ahead and save this, double check that our interface configs is saved, which it is. I'm going to quit out of this. We're going to cd into interface config, do an ls, and then we're going to do Ansible -playbook, configure interfaces.yaml, do our password and username, and we should be able to run now. Let's see what happens. So we can see that it's run through the devices. And it's applied our configurations. All right, so let's look at what it's changed. So it looks like these interfaces were already up. So, we know we've set a description. We know that we're setting up DHCP and getting the interface configured. We did set an IP address on the interface. We also configured the DHCP address. It looks like it already had that. And then for the Nexus switches, it looks like we've set up our interface. We set our name. So it did configure our devices and get everything already set up. Let's go over now and take a look at CML and see what the actual interfaces look like. So if we go to console, we can do enable and we do show run interface gig 1. We can see the description of when that has been set. The IP address is DHCP. We can look at 2 and we can see that the link to N9KV switch 1 is set. The IP address has been set to 100.254 as we set in our variable files. And then if we log into our Nexus switch, we should see very similar setup. So we'll do show run int e1/1. We have an IP address. We have a link description set up. It is set for no switch port, which is that mode option that we set for layer 3, and then it is no shut. We should be able to ping 192.168.100.254 now. And we can see that we're able to ping. So Ansible just configured gig 1, gig 2, and ETH11 with configuration using some variables that we assigned through a host vars file, using an Ansible playbook and some tasks to get the devices configured. And we did it by managing, there's a pretty big playbook here. It's 46 lines, or I should say a tasks list of things we want to run on devices. But if you were going to manage your interfaces on a per file basis, instead of doing it as a variable file of a list of interfaces, you're going to need a file per device. And then you're going to need to configure all of the interfaces the way you want them configured and set each of these options up manually. But you can see, we've managed different states of interfaces. This one's layer 2. This one has an IP. This one is using DHCP. This one's not. We've been able to manage that by using conditionals inside our interfaces file where we just need to configure interfaces. This should be universal across iOS. Same with NXOS. Very, very similar. We just have this one difference here of mode that we need to account for. And if this was a switch, we would need to account for it on a switch as well. And then for our layer 3 interfaces, where we have these two differences, we have two different sets of modules, or we use the same module, we call it two different ways. But what we can do here is we just call this one time now. So this playbook will set layer 3 interfaces up for every single device I have, as long as they're in a interfaces variable and as long as I've got a name and IP set up. If I set this DHCP parameter, I have a separate DHCP module that'll run to set the DHCP interfaces. And if we're in NXOS, we get our layer 3 set up. So That's configured all of our layer 3 interfaces. I didn't touch the CLI at all. We were able to create file structure with interfaces, using a loop, or I should say a list of interfaces that's super portable. I can take this and I can start configuring multiple devices. I could just add another router into this, set, gig 3 up on here, and then connect it to another router, build a new variable file, and rerun it and get that device up. So as you start to build out these configurations and these playbooks, you start to get a lot of reusable code. Doing it this way, at least in my opinion, I have found to be one of the easiest ways to manage and operate your network using Ansible. And even if you don't use Ansible to configure your devices, this is a great way to verify now that your devices are configured the way you want them. If I come back up now, we've already run this. I haven't made any changes. Let's just do a -- check. So we know the interfaces are configured the way we want them. Let's just make sure that the state is the way they should be. So we can see we're getting green OKs because nothing has changed on our devices. And we'll wait for it to finish looking at the Nexus platform. It's taking a minute here. And now it should just about be done. All right, so we're finished. So nothing changed. What if let's do this. I'm going to change this to, say, DHCP. I'm going to change this here. And then I'm going to go into my Nexus switch, and I'm going to do show run in E1/1, conf t in E1/1. I'm going to just do description none. And if we do show run in E11, we see the description's changed. I'm going to rerun the check. So we know that we changed what the configuration for the description should be in the variable file for CAKV Internet. We also changed the Nexus. So let's take a look at the changes. And what Ansible should show us is that the cat AKV has changed and the Nexus has changed. It's not going to tell us why per se, but there is a change that needs to be addressed. But this is a really great way to test your environment to verify that the state of it is the way you configured it and the way that you want it. We're going to see the Nexus pop back. The description has changed. It doesn't tell us that that is what changed, but we'll wait for this to finish. We should be able to add some V's to this, get a little more verbosity, and we should be able to see those changes. And you see, we're seeing a lot of the details about how the devices are being configured, what it's doing. And it shows us the before state, which is before IPv4 enabled true. It shows us all the interface configs, and it gives you the state of the configuration of the device. And if we look, we can see here where the Nexus 9K is. We have this description none, enabled true, layer 3, ETH11, but the description it wants to apply, so the only thing that's changed is description, it's going to update that. It's going to make sure ETH11 gets the access port config set up as its description. We should also see that, I think we lost it. Up on the iOS devices, we should have seen a similar behavior, but because of the amount of output, we lost it. But you can see in this Nexus config, we were able to check it. We can see that after it's going to change this configuration to be access port config. If we come down here, we should see the before, which is this description none, and it's going to make this change. So let's quit this. We're not going to do the check this time. We're not going to do the VVV. We're going to let it reapply the configurations. And I want to update my description for the WAN-NAT interface to indicate that it's a DHCP interface. But I also want to reset the link to CAKV Internet back to that proper description. which while we're waiting for this to run, we're going to come back and we're going to watch the change has already occurred. And Ansible's wrapping up its configuration. So even if you don't use it to configure your devices, it's a great way to manage the state of your system. So start building your variable files to understand your environment, how things are configured. And then when you want to know if things have changed, you just run the check and go, oh, something's changed. This is, is it supposed to be like that? Should we update our variables? Or is it something that needs to be reverted back? And, somebody made a change that was kind of out of, whatever cycle you're doing. They changed it, didn't update the variable files, or they changed it and they shouldn't have changed it, and we're going to revert it back with the automation. And so that really just kind of covers setting up the layer 3 interfaces. So I'm going to hold off on doing the layer 2 part. We're going to cover that in the next video, where we actually go through now and set up VLANs on this Nexus 9KV. We're going to add a host to CML so that we can connect it to the environment. And then we're going to start managing VLANs. I'm going to do that separately because we're going to introduce yet another variable to this file. And we're going to work out the same playbook structure we've got here. We're going to use interface config, and we're going to add VLANs to this setup. We're going to configure a different task folder for VLANs, and we're going to set up the Nexus. And we're going to start really building out this playbook configuration to manage more aspects of our devices. So I hope you found this video useful. If there's something you want to know about individual device configs, let me know in the video so that we can cover it in the next one. If there's things that you're interested in about how things would get done using these host vars or group vars files, and how you can really start to bring everything together, I would be happy to show it to you and make it part of the next video. But again, for the next video, we're going to expand on what we've done here and go ahead and start building out layer 2 configurations, setting up some switch ports, getting some VLANs assigned, and adding some additional modules like the VLAN module and the L2 interfaces module, so we can start managing those specific functions. So again, let me know what you think. Hope you enjoyed watching this video, and let me know any feedback you have. Thanks for watching.